Greetings. This is Mike Dierks, Regional Missionary Coordinator for the Presbytery of Ohio. And today we have a special guest, Reverend Lacy Andrews, who's the Regional Missionary of the Presbytery of the Southeast. And he recently, along with Al Carrico, published an article in the New Horizons. It was kind of a message for the churches, for church plants, around the idea of dying to ourselves. So I'm going to ask Lacy, just kind of give a synopsis of that message.
Yeah, I think maybe one good place to start would be when this seed was planted in my mind. Al referred to it in the meeting, but when a friend said to me in relation to church planting, when do those who follow the seeker-sensitive approach, when do they tell their people they have to die? And then later I realized, well, when do we tell our people that we have to die as well? We all know what Jesus said when he talked about discipleship. He said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. And most of the time when we do that, we think in terms of our own personal walk with Christ, our struggle with sin, indwelling sin, temptation, putting to death, mortifying the deeds of the flesh in order to live for him. But what I've found in wrestling in mission works is that there's a much broader application to that principle. One of the things that I wanted to address both in the article and when I've used this in Bible study is the fact that this is certainly true of individuals that we're to die to self, but also for us to think in terms of the corporate expression. What happens when we plant a church? What happens when there's a group of people that have a burden to plant a church? And I realized that the group itself must see itself as a seed that dies and is planted in order that Christ be glorified in the planting of a church. And so I began to make that application to our mission works. And in fact, past several times when we've begun a work, the first Bible study has been this Bible study. Because I want to lay it out before the folks from the very beginning that, you're coming together. This is a spiritual endeavor and that you must be willing to die to self. That is, even to your own preferences, maybe even your own dreams, for the sake of what it is that Christ is accomplishing in a work. And so I've suggested a change in nomenclature from core group, which has all kinds of problems, because as it grows, the mission work grows, a lot of times people think, well, we're the core group. We're the group within the group. What we think matters most, but have suggested we think in terms of seed group in order to get the idea of dying to self for the sake of the kingdom up front.
Very good. Let's flesh that out a little bit in a mission work. How does it get expressed? I mean, kind of in the day-to-day life of each other. They're setting chairs up, they're putting hymn books out, they're, figuring out who's going to pass the plate, set up the, all of the duties that are getting assigned.
Right.
But how do they die to themselves as they're trying to work together to bring about a church?
Yeah, I think what happens oftentimes is people think that they're dying when maybe they're not. Or as Luke tells us, Jesus says, take up your cross daily and follow me. We die, but then over time, we don't. And sometimes when we're setting up chairs, tearing down chairs, coming in early, staying late, taking hymnals home in boxes, bringing them back, packing up musical instruments so that we can have a company when we sing, all of the things that are necessary, plus getting out the checkbook and writing checks, which are often sacrificial to see the work go forward. We think of ourselves, well, we're sacrificing. But are we dying? Are we dying? And where it raises its head oftentimes is when things don't quite go the way we think that they should go, and or the way we would like for it to be. You see, it's really, we really are only, we only are dying when we're willing to lay down our lives and our preferences. Sacrifice isn't true sacrifice if we look to the end of that and say, well, there's something that I'm going to gain, something I'm going to receive. A church that looks like the way I want the church to look, a church that worships the way I want it to worship in every detail, even of matters that are not substantive or principle. Now, I prefer that we use this creed, or I prefer that we sing these hymns, or I prefer this order in the liturgy, and not talking about principial things. But I sacrificed, I gave. I came in early. I left early. I got tired setting up chairs and tearing them down, and without realizing that the sacrifice is to do these things unto Christ. And that's what happens when we die to self.
So it's almost there, and people aren't consciously thinking this, but there's this, I've sacrificed so much, I deserve a bigger voice. Is
That's
that
right.
kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah. And as soon as we do that, we realize all of the sacrifice, it's not really sacrifice, because the end is not what does Christ want, what glorifies him, but the end is, well, I should get what I want. This is my dream. This is my vision. And what happened is, somewhere along the way, the person forgot that they're to die. And it happens to all of us. I mean, all of us have this struggle. I do want to talk a little bit about established churches, especially in this regard, if you're ready to go there yet.
Yeah, I was just about to wander there, but before we go there,
Okay.
think about the impact of that when they're calling that first minister,
Yeah.
the church planner, and how that can be really destructive, or when they are dying to themselves, beneficial.
Yeah. It oftentimes what we find is problems occur not when you call the organizing pastor. Everybody's excited then. And typically when an organizing pastor's called, those that have been there from the beginning, they're the most eager and excited about this man. They're weary and they think, well, he's going to help carry the load, but they're convinced that he's the man. But it's often those that are most excited that 6 months, usually a little longer than that, 9 months or a year down the road, they're the ones that are ready to leave. And part of that is when they began, there's this intimacy that exists within that original group of people as they're working together. But a minister comes, even though it doesn't change anything. I mean, the liturgy can be exactly the same, the vision of the church the same, everything about it, except for there's a different personality who's in leadership that's in the work. And that can be enough to unsettle people. And when that happens, if a person realizes that I'm struggling, that this is what they need to confront themselves with, or what they need to gently be shepherded and confronted with by the session, say, brother, or sister, you need to remember, we die to ourselves. This is about Christ and his church. It's not about our preferences, or it's not about, I don't feel appreciated, or it's not about, I don't feel like I have as much say as I once had. Now, we have to die to those kinds of things in order to live under Christ and to see the fruit that Christ is going to establish from the planting of a seed.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's take it. What's the message? Because this is a message for all of us. It's not just
It is
individually and corporately. So take it to the church that's established, that's been, around for 12, 15, 20 years. And, how do we embrace this message as a corporate body?
Yeah, I think one way that we need to do that is that we need to think in terms of planting other churches, mother-daughter churches. I don't know what's happening in every corner of the OPC, but in the Presbytery of the Southeast, this is becoming the most dominant model again, mother-daughter churches. And oftentimes what happens is in our churches, because of the preaching and teaching and sound theology and worship that is according to God's prescription, and because genuine shepherding is taking place, people who are like-minded are willing to drive 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour to come to our churches. And some of our churches convince themselves, well, we're a viable, strong church. We can pay the preacher, we can pay the light bill, we own our own building. And yet they're doing it on the backs of people that are driving 30, 45 minutes in an hour away. And one way a congregation can die to itself is to say, how do we best serve these that are commuting and coming from long distances? Well, maybe we need to plant a church where they are, where they can invite their neighbors to come, where they don't have to drive 30 or 45 minutes to get here every Sunday. And that's a fearful thing to do, because if you do that, you're going to lose families, sometimes key families within the life of the church, in order to plant a church, sometimes the strongest, most committed families, because they're the ones that are making these long drives, and yet they're not going to be here any longer. What we have found is that every time a church steps out to do that, the Lord takes care of the mother church in extraordinary ways. I can give you a number of examples where I have seen that happen recently in the life of our churches that stood up and said, we need to support these people that are driving a distance. We need to reach those areas too. Let's step out. Let's plant a church. We even had one of our churches that's got 2 mission works now and is assisting in a third in the Presbytery of the Mid-Atlantic, that had a potential to buy a building, to have its own building, and yet realized, because of what God was doing in planting these daughter churches, this is not the time for us to move ahead and buy a building so they're still in a rental situation in order to facilitate the church planting that they're doing. That is a church dying to itself. That's a session that's willing to die for the sake of the gospel. I've seen little churches. You say they're too little. They can't afford to lose 4 or 5 families. And yet these 4 or 5 families are driving 45 minutes to come to church. Step out in faith and say, we think this is what God's calling us to do. And then as soon as they start planting, guess what? People start showing up at church. They get interested. They start joining membership classes, and they're coming in. Yeah. I visited one of our churches that it's always been a sound church with a great deal of unity after turmoil years ago, but a great deal of unity over the past close to 20 years. But it's struggled to grow. It's been small. At first, they were reluctant, or some on the session were reluctant to step out and to do church planting with people that were driving distances. But then they said, no, this is what God's calling us to do. They got a mission work now. They got an exploratory Bible study in the next city over now, midweek. I went to visit there. I called my wife and I said, I haven't seen this many people at this church in I don't know how many years, because of all the people that the Lord's sending to the mother church. You don't send in order to get, you send in order to see the kingdom grow, but the Lord still rewards. And when the Lord rewards in those ways, it's a time of rejoicing. But that's the fruit of the willingness to die and die to self. So yes, organized congregations need to be thinking in these terms.
Thank you, Lacy, for those things. As we wrap up, specifically, how can we as churches pray about dying to ourselves as a corporate body?
Yeah, I think one thing is when we're praying for each other, and especially in our established churches, and especially established churches. I don't know what it's like in the Presbytery of Ohio, but in our presbytery, a lot of our churches have a lot of people that are commuting and coming from long distances to come to church. In praying for those, but turning that prayer from just Lord bless them, Lord give them strength as they're driving this distance, but Lord create opportunities for them to share the gospel where they are, and Lord give us an opportunity to plant a church where they are. That's a good place to start, is to, like you said, be intentionally mission minded. And so that's one thing that I would say up front in terms of praying. And don't forget to pray for the mission works, but also for those that are mothering mission works, those churches, to pray for those congregations and to pray for God's blessing upon them as they've stepped out in faith to plant other churches. It's an exciting time in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. We have more regional missionaries we've ever had before. That are hard at work, and they are gifted men. They're very different from each other in the way they carry out their ministries. Pray for the regional missionaries too, as they encourage church plants, and as they encourage mother churches and daughtering churches.
Well, thank you, Lacy. It's been really inspiring just hearing you and the good things. And I really, again, I'm going to thank you again for working with Al, putting that article together, and the challenges out there to the churches. So let's embrace it, because we've got a God that will provide.
That's right. We do. We've seen it over and over and over again.
All right. Well, God bless. Thank you, Lacy.
Thank you.